Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's 3GNY program. My name is Michael Mantell. I'm a psychotherapist, educator, and 3G, the grandchild of Holocaust survivors Mickey Mendelovich from Sighet, Romania, and Alice Diamond from Satu Mare, Romania. I'm also proud to serve as a board member of 3GNY. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for grandchildren of Holocaust survivors and supporters. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and to provide a supportive forum for descendants of survivors. We empower 3Gs to share their stories. 3GNY's flagship educational initiative, We Do, which is short for We Educate, empowers grandchildren of Holocaust survivors to compellingly share their families' Holocaust experiences in classrooms and with community groups. Through our grandparents' stories, we provide a human face to the past and a living link to the present, inspiring our listeners to stand up to hatred and to act with courage and compassion, something the world desperately needs more of today. Since 2005, 3GNY has trained more than 500 speakers in New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and around the country. We've shared our stories in more than 1,500 classrooms and have impacted more than 60,000 students and community members. And between our live programming and YouTube channel, more than 18,000 additional people have heard our stories. Hope is not lost, and we need to keep doing this work, now more than ever. You can help us accomplish this through a donation to 3GNY, which will go directly toward engaging more students and schools and speakers, thus reaching even more students with these impactful stories. We do not solicit donations from schools, teachers, or students. We provide our programming to schools completely free in order to remove any barriers from connecting students with moving personal testimony from the Holocaust. Similarly, we provide community programs like tonight's conversation to help us all find meaning and connection through our shared history and identity. We are grateful for your donations to support our work and programs like this one. There is a link with ways to donate in the chat, and we hope you'll consider making a gift. If you've contributed before, thank you so much for your support. It is because of donors like you that we can educate students and the community about the lessons of the Holocaust through our families' personal stories. Now, I'm very excited to introduce to you our special guest for tonight's program, Brooke Randel. Brooke has been involved with 3GNY since 2021, when she completed our We Do speaker training program and began volunteering with us to share her Bubbie's story in schools. Brooke is a writer, editor, and associate creative director living in Chicago. Her writing has been published in Hippocampus, Hypertext Magazine, Jewish Fiction, and elsewhere. The granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, she writes on issues of memory, trauma, family, and history. For the last few years, we've been hearing from Brooke about the Holocaust memoir she's been working on at the urging of her grandmother, her Bubbie. And we are so excited to celebrate the publication yesterday of Brooke's book, also here, Love, Literacy, and the Legacy of the Holocaust. A quick note to our audience members, please feel free to drop your questions and comments in the Q&A feature throughout this program, and we will do our best to get to all of them tonight. Brooke, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and mazel tov on the publication of your book, which officially became available for purchase. I'll start off with questions, one or two, and hopefully, Brooke, your answers will generate more questions from our audience. Before I ask a question, I had the privilege of reading your memoir before it became available to the public. So I want to say that you captured the absolute love and devotion of a grandmother to her grandchild. And with such beauty and delicateness, you tell how you repay her, how you show up for her, as she has always done for you. To me, you wrote a truly beautiful and honest love letter to your Bubbie. You helped me remember and feel moments that I had with my grandmother. You helped me relive these moments, ones that I had forgotten about, but I'm so grateful to you for reminding me of. So now to the questions. To start us off, before we get into questions about the book, can you share a little bit about your Bubbie Goldie?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me and for everyone for joining. I'm so excited to get to share a little bit more about my book with you all. But first, my Bubbie, who's really at the heart of this book. Um, my Bubbie Goldie is, or she was just like a very feisty, kind of restless person, very outgoing and social. She was an amazing baker. And she originally came from Romania, actually from the same town, Michael, that your grandparents came from. And she grew up there. After the war, she emigrated to Canada and eventually to the United States. And so she was kind of always moving, never quite settled. And that was sort of how she moved through the world in general.
Beautiful, thank you. Can you tell us a little bit how this project came to be?
Yeah, so I think every like person who has a Holocaust survivor in their family kind of comes to learn the story in different ways. And for me, this project started with my grandma calling me and starting like in the middle of a conversation about something completely else. She would just say, "You should write about me." And I would be completely thrown by this. It always sounded like it was coming off the cuff for her. It's just like, what is happening? Like, we never talk about the Holocaust. Like, this is not information I even know really. So like, how would I ever write about it? But like phone call after phone call, she would mention it and it would just come up in the middle of a topic, something else. And I started to like really listen to her and like think about it seriously. Like, I think she really means this. And so this kind of began this process of kind of unraveling the silence in our family because it was not something we spoke about openly. It was like something we all knew, but at the same time did not know any details around. And so she finally convinced me. It took a very long time. And I flew down to Florida to really sit down and interview her. And that is really where the book begins.
Beautiful. What do you think gave the urgency of her request?
This is a great question. I never got a clear answer from her. So, the impetus for this book is still somewhat of a mystery to me. Um, I have a couple theories. I think she had other survivor friends, and I think she started to see them talk about it a little bit more openly or write down their memories. And I think, that inspired her a little bit, and it made her feel like maybe she's safe enough to now go there and to remember, and that for a long time it really wasn't safe enough. There was still a lot of surviving to do. And I think the weight of holding all that in and sort of protecting us, her children and grandchildren, from knowing the details of what happened, I think that weight just grew kind of heavy. And she really did want people to know what she had been through and hold a little bit of it themselves because it was on her alone in a lot of ways.
You do a beautiful job of weaving the present into her story, and you share that for months. She asked you to write this book, as you said, and you talked about this feeling the weight of the request every time she asked it of you. So then, what was it that changed for you to finally begin to write it or to agree to write it?
Yeah, so there was like one phone call in particular where like it finally clicked for me. I was at work and no one really ever called me when I was at work, but whenever my Bubbie called, it was always a very short call. So I was like, this won't take that long. Let me just pick up and see what's going on. And so I picked up, I said hello, and right away she said wrong number and she hung up on me. And I mean, it cracked me up. I just was like immediately laughing in my office. And I realized like this is a big part of why she's asking me to tell her story. The reason she called me is and hung up right away is because she wanted to call my brother. And so as soon as she heard my voice, she knew I wasn't him, and so she hung up. And the reason she didn't know which grandkid she was calling is because that she couldn't read. And so she had an address book with all our names and numbers, but she was always kind of forgetting who was what because she had to memorize it to know who she was calling. And so she would just call and be like, nope, not the person, and hang up. And um, her literacy is actually like a big kind of driving force for me because it's very unusual for a Holocaust survivor not to be able to read, even though many survivors had, their childhood, adolescence, early adulthood interrupted. Many still went on to get a full education, and that wasn't her story. And so for her to tell her story, she knew she needed someone else to help her write it. And I realized that was a big piece of why she was asking me, that this, to her, this felt like something she couldn't do herself, and she needed someone else to help facilitate like the sharing of her story.
Yeah, literacy is a big theme in your book, and it's interesting because you say your Bubbie didn't know how to read, and yet you are a writer. So there's that big gap between your lived experiences, and you talk about that the gap between your Bubbie's life and her grandchildren, for example, and how that success ironically puts a distance between your lives and potentially the relationship or the interconnections. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think all the ways we're different from one another were almost things that she like strove for. She wanted me to have opportunities she never had. She wanted me to have successes that she wasn't able to reach. And so the ways that kind of like got in our way sometimes in our relationship and made it hard to connect or relate because our lives were so different or our experiences were so different. That was almost by design because she worked really hard so that I would, and my parents, the generation before me would have these opportunities that were not present in her life.
So, what about you made you the ideal candidate for your Bubbie to ask you to write this book?
Well, I mean, on one hand, she knew that I like to write, and that was like a key part of it. But I also think part of it is that I was the youngest grandchild. And so I did literally have the most distance from her. And there is something to this distance that makes it easier to look backwards. I think the closer you are to it, the harder it is to really see it and to sit with it. My grandma, I described it as restless earlier, but that's really a characteristic that runs in our family. There's a lot of restless people in our family. There's a lot of people who've learned to live with silence and not remember because it's really painful to sit still and remember. And so I think it did take a certain amount of distance and kind of sense of safety to be able to look back and kind of cope with what's known, what's not known, piecing it together. None of this was linear in any way. So there was a lot of work in kind of stitching it together and really sitting with what happened, which is something really no one in my family had done before.
Yeah, you did a beautiful job of weaving those themes also of silence, pain, and trauma into the story, into the text. Really well done. So, in that vein, you're bringing up, what was it like to finally set down to this task? Yeah, to either interview, do the research, or to actually come to writing the book.
Yeah, what came first was the interview. I sat down with her and I felt like this was going to be a really meaningful moment between the two of us, and it was gonna like feel very personal, and like she was just talking to me and she was telling me her story, giving me information I never had before. But one of the first things she did, because I did record these interviews, is she would look at my laptop and she would say, "My name is Golda Indig." And I was like, who is she introducing herself to? Like, I'm right here. I know who she is. And that was kind of when I realized, like, oh, we have different visions of what's happening right now. So something I thought would be really personal and intimate, um, for her was like, this is an official historical document. I'm going to tell my story. I'm going to tell it right. I'm going to make it very clear. And she was like professional. She was like going into it with that kind of like larger sense of obligation and duty. And I was just like so caught off guard. I thought we were going to talk like we normally talk, and that wasn't her demeanor at all. And so it was like throughout the conversation, I was like slowly kind of realizing our different intentions, our different plans. She really like had it in her and just wanted to talk. So there wasn't even a lot of space for questions. And she would just kind of freely move through her story. And I'd, be trying to like piece together the timeline and understand what's happening here and, how she's saying this, all of these like small details. Those steamrolled by me the first time for sure.
So you talk about what her intention was from the beginning. You sat down to this. What was your initial understanding or intention of what you were going to do? And when you set forth on this project of writing it, then what was the intention?
Yeah, I wanted to learn the details. And so I wanted her to go slowly, clearly. I wanted it to be linear, for everything to make sense, to have the names, the details, the emotions. But that wasn't all accessible for her. Some of these emotions were very well buried and not something she wanted to access, not something she could access. Some of them were right at the surface and they were there whether she wanted it or not. And so there's kind of this fragmentary nature of the storytelling in which she's saying things not necessarily in the exact order they happened, but as she's reliving them and refeeling them in the moment. And so for me, it was definitely a practice of listening and trying to understand. But I rewatched our interviews many times to transcribe them. And I learned something every single time I listened to what she was saying and really observed like how she's moving from topic to topic. When she would maybe dip into a different language, sometimes she would imitate someone or her voice would change or just her body language. And so it's from both sitting with her and then also sitting with my interviews with her that I really started to understand how the story kind of lived in her body.
Oh, that's amazing. So you briefly share about what it was like interviewing your Bubbie. Were there ever moments when you were thinking this might be too hard for her or even too hard for you or more than you signed up for?
I was very worried early on that like I would ask a question that would hurt her too much. Like I had to be careful and kind of tend to her in that way. And I think that's somewhat true, but more often than not, she just proved that she could absolutely handle it and that I was more likely to be the one that you know, was unsure or felt hesitant. She was more comfortable with it than I was, but it hadn't been an open topic, so there was no way for me to know like where the line was. And so I was very conscious of not pushing too far or asking too much, just trying to be like very sensitive. And she maybe didn't need quite as much of that as I was giving.
Wow. Can you tell us how long the whole process took from start to finish?
Yeah, so the book took me 9 years to write, but I marked that from when I flew to Florida, and she started asking me to write her story like a year and a half before that. So we're probably talking more like a decade. If you think about it when she started the project versus when I started the project. But it took a very long time. In addition to, sitting down and interviewing her, I interviewed other family members. I did a lot of research, digging into the archives, trying to find what I could to kind of fill in the story, and a lot of kind of writing and revising as well to shape the story and really consider both her story and then my own story within this of actually, understanding what my family history was.
Awesome. We do have some questions from the audience, so everyone please feel free to continue to write your questions or even comments. I'm happy to share them, and I'll weave them into my own. Somebody asks, did your Bubbie talk about any of her experiences to you or family when you were younger?
Not unprompted. Basically, she never brought it up. I think at various points her grandkids got assignments about interviewing a family member or, doing a family history report, and they would come to her with questions. And it wasn't her kids' questions that she answered, it was her grandkids' questions. That's when it started to happen. And she would give very quick, very brief answers. she would give something, but it wasn't much. And I think the even that someone cared and asked questions though started to make her think differently about sharing, but it took a very long time. For many years she did not talk about it at all.
Yeah, it's a very common for Holocaust survivors, I think. Yeah. From reading your book, to me, your Bubbie sounds like an incredible woman, someone who was driven to help others. That was another theme that I found in your book, but also was sound like it was something that was common throughout her life. What was your relationship like with your Bubbie, and how would you describe her before versus after interviewing her and writing this book?
Yeah, there's so much that's similar or the same before and after, because she always loved me very fiercely. Like it didn't matter what I was doing. She was a fan. It was just that I existed that made her love me. I think there was nothing more specific than that. Um, but before this, our we didn't have many ways to connect. Um, Things I was into or passionate about, whether that's like reading and writing or even like sports, things that mattered in my life, they didn't matter in hers, or she couldn't connect to them. And so in a lot of ways, like we didn't have many ways to connect. So it was pretty much we would bake together sometimes, we would watch TV, and we would play cards. And those were kind of our avenues. But once I sat down with her and we started like working on this together, I started writing about her, we were able to actually have like deeper conversations, because all of those other activities didn't involve a lot of conversation. And so we were able to like connect with one another and listen to one another in a very new way. And that was definitely like a growth in our relationship. Like it was the same love, but there was a distance before that we were slowly bridging the more we were talking about the past.
And I think it's beautiful how, in some ways, the relationship evolved. And I think your understanding of your Bubbie had changed, because you mentioned that in your book. There's almost like this evolution of who you thought she was and certain quirks or things that she did, to then kind of understanding them more from her perspective. It's quite beautiful the way you put that in your book. Um, has delving into your Bubbie's life story done anything, changed your own identity? Has it made it different for you how you identify, for example, as a Jewish person, as a descendant of Holocaust survivors?
I do feel more connected to this history. Like I don't know that I had given it much thought before. Um, in the book, I talk about it being like a film over my life. Like it's not a current part of my life. It's not pressing, but it's there. And, I'm at where I'm at in my life in large part because the people who came before me, and what they did. And so, or what they even experienced, not necessarily just did, but, um, I just started to see these connections between past and present. And I never felt actually any connection to the past before, and starting to understand it really like deepen my connection to her. In addition, there was a moment in my research where an old family photo we found, and it was her family of origin. And like for the first time, I really realized like, oh, this is my family. Like I always thought about it as her family and people she lost. It was only like late in the process I realized I'm related to these people. Like they're part of my family, And it just took so long to have that thought because the distance between the past was so great. I mean, so many things had changed in my family, from like my grandma's identity, her nationality, the languages she spoke. And so she seemed like a completely different person to me. When I only in doing this work, I realized it's one person. She went through this as a 13-year-old and then grew into, the octogenarian that I knew and loved.
Were there any questions you wanted to ask your Bubbie but didn't, or questions you didn't think to ask but got answered anyway, or questions you didn't yet have a chance to ask but would like to know?
There were always questions I wish I could ask, but I knew I couldn't because they were really specific, or they were looking for like a broader like understanding or analysis. Like there are certain types of reflecting she couldn't do. And you know, when I would try, like, you know, if I wanted to know how something felt, for example, she would just give me something concrete about it. Like she couldn't necessarily go into the level of detail I always wanted. And like throughout the process, I realized like what I want is really fiction. Like I want all the details of a good story, all the nuance, and that isn't always there when it comes to memory. Some of that is lost. And so part of this was just like coping with the fact that there are absences in the story, there are details that are lost, some things we can imagine and some things we can't, and that's okay. And so I do have those types of questions, but I'm also like somewhat at peace with them. I was able to get so much more than I ever could have expected, that all the things I couldn't get, like that's just part of the story.
I definitely lived through you vicariously through reading your memoir of your time and your experience and your interviews with your Bubbie. So it meant a lot to me to travel through that with you. Um, Another attendee, Julia, is asking, did you ever have a chance to travel with your Bubbie to Romania or any other of the significant locations from her childhood, or did she ever return to any of them on her own?
I have never traveled to any of like the significant places of her past. She did return to her hometown in the 70s. I think that was the only time she returned. It was not her idea, it was her husband's. And I think it was meaningful and important to him, but for her, it was a really painful return. It wasn't a place she really wanted to be because it wasn't the place she remembered. Like the people that she knew there weren't there. It was, you know, it was a shell of what it had been for her. And so I think she went and it was part of this trip, and you know, it wasn't something she sought out or necessarily wanted.
And in addition to interviewing your Bubbie, you also did a lot of research to understand more of what she was talking about, to learn the background of Jews in Romania, et cetera. Can you talk about the research part of this endeavor and what that was like for you?
Yeah, some of what I did was more like broad level research. So I read a lot of Holocaust survivors' testimonies, and I specifically sought out survivors who were in the same camps that she was in, just to get a sense of what it was like. She was in 3 different Nazi concentration camps, and each one was quite different from the next. So just to learn how many there were, how different they could be from one another, the experience, and even the experience of prisoners, how it differed from one to another. It wasn't a necessarily uniform experience from person to person. So some of that was like background research for me to understand those details. But then I also did research specifically on members of my family going through international tracing service to pull documents and see what still existed. As many people know, a lot was destroyed in the war, but there were documents after the war, and some even during the war, that have been preserved. And so, you know, part of the work was just saying, what is out there? What can I find?
And you were like a sleuth. You were a detective trying to find information. And I think you even talk about this in your book about receiving a packet of so many documents that you didn't even know existed, right? Were there any surprising facts about the family, any family secrets that you uncovered, either from the research or just from speaking with from your Bubbie that you didn't expect to hear?
I didn't expect anything because I had been under the assumption that everything had been destroyed and we have nothing. There are no records. And that wasn't true. And so the fact that I was able to find some of these things was just mind-blowing to me, that there's this validation out there. And that was really powerful. Some of the kind of nuance and detail I picked up was what happened after the war, where she went. Um, some of those stories came from her, but also she had to return to a DP camp, which is like a refugee camp, a displaced persons camp, in order to like go through the emigration process. And so I got to see like oh, she had to go back to Germany. She left Germany when she was liberated, but she had to go back to go through the emigration process, and she had to live there for a few years before the papers came through.
Another great question from Anne. She's asking, what level of religion was your Bubbie? So maybe you can talk about the role of Judaism in her life, either before, during, and after the Holocaust.
Yeah, this is a complex question. My grandma, her father died when she was 7 years old. This was before the war. It was unrelated to it. Um, but I think a lot of things changed for her, and she was only 7, and so like my understanding is that like most families in Sighet, Romania, they were an Orthodox family, but because they had lost their father, they were all kind of working and striving in different ways just to put food on the table. And so she didn't emphasize like the traditions or what, things they had to go through. Like, that wasn't part of her stories. I think they did keep Shabbat, but I don't know much more detail than that. I think they were really just working to survive in a lot of ways. Um, but after the war, I think because she didn't have like a solid religious foundation, she was, not Orthodox, but maybe more on the reform side. It was always a part of her life. Um, but in at that time, she wasn't allowed to go to yeshiva. It was for boys only. So it was a different kind of cultural experience for her being a girl who was needed at home, whose family was struggling, than it would have been even for the brothers she had in her family.
I think from reading your book, there seem to be a lot of similarities. Whenever I read Holocaust testimonies or memoirs, I'm always looking for some insight into my own family's life. So there were some similarities, especially the trajectory they took during the Holocaust. Your Bubbie also had a little bit of an uncommon path during the Holocaust in the camps. Can you talk a little bit about her experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first camp she went to was Auschwitz. And at Auschwitz, there was a selection process in which people would either be sent to work or sent to the gas chambers. And there were 2 times when she was there when she was sent to the left side to the gas chambers. Um, and both times she was able to escape. The first time someone pulled her out of the line and brought her back to the work group where her sister was. And the second time, no one came and she escaped on her own. She was just watching the guards, waiting for them to look away. And when they did, she sprinted out of the line. She ran around this building and she found the group where her sister was in, and she just kind of sprinted straight for it. That group was sent to a new camp. And so on the roll for that camp, her name wasn't listed because she had snuck into it. They had no record of her being there. And so her experience in this labor camp was one of hiding. She was constantly hiding from the Nazis inside their own camp. When they would do rolls, she would stay inside the barracks. When they would inspect the barracks, she would go out in like the forest or in the bathroom and just hide. And she was in that camp for the duration of the year she was imprisoned. And it, strangely enough, like we don't think about these horrific experiences as being long and boring, but it became really boring for her just to be alone and in hiding all the time. And she eventually snuck to the kitchen at that camp and started helping other prisoners prepare the food just so she wouldn't be alone all day. And so, yeah, part of how she survived was sprinting and was hiding.
And your Bubbie passed away in 2022. Did she have the opportunity to listen to the book? And if yes, what was her reaction to the book?
Yes, so she couldn't read it herself, so I knew I would have to read it to her. And so I printed it and got it nicely bound at FedEx, and I went over to see her. And it took us maybe a few weeks, maybe a month or more, to go chapter by chapter reading the book. And there were definitely things that caught her off guard or she wasn't expecting. Um, there are things I talked about who she was or her experiences that she would have loved to keep out of the book. You know, not being able to read wasn't something she was proud of, and she had a lot of shame about it. But to me, it's a really big part of the story, and the fact that she was able to accomplish so much and to do so much in her life, despite her illiteracy, is actually an incredible feat. And so we definitely had like conversations about that word illiterate, which she really didn't like. But the parts about the Holocaust, especially the parts that I had directly transcribed from our conversations, she really liked. And I think it felt very powerful for her just to be heard and for someone to relay it back to her, to know that like she got her message through and she told her story. That was, I think, really validating, important to her. I ended up leaving a copy of the manuscript at her apartment, and she would like offer it to anyone who walked in for them to see it and like to know her a little bit better. And so it really was like powerful for her to kind of see her experiences reflected on the page, or to know that they were reflected there.
Wow, that's so beautiful. I go back to your book, how you started and how she's literally there the moment you're bored or the day you're bored, how she's holding you. And here you're holding her life in this manuscript, in this book, essentially. So it's such a beautiful circle of life. The way you're in each other's lives, it's quite beautiful. Um, and you share a lot of personal information in the book, like you said. Uh, um, what was it like for you to put that in the book? And how did your family react to reading the book, or if anyone read it, what was the reaction of others?
Yeah, so far the reaction has been good. I feel like we have not told the story for so long that to be able to tell it is actually quite liberating. It's not like something we have to carry or something we have to hide. Like there's actually some pride in being able to own your past and know it and share the details. And so the reaction has been positive. Even though there are like negative things in the book, it's not like a purely romantic portrayal. Like, nothing in life is perfect. And I did want to like capture that humanity. But when you do that, I think it's really like the wholeness of the picture that comes through, not just the negative pieces. And there's something kind of beautiful, even if vulnerable. There's something really freeing about it.
I agree. And I think for the reader, it makes us feel like we have permission to enter into this world as well.
Totally. It's a history that a lot of people don't have easy access to. And I didn't at the beginning of this process. And so that was something that was important to me, to kind of create that entry points and in starting to look back.
So I love that also in your book, because I look at you and what you've accomplished as a 3G, as a person, as a writer, and I think, wow, I mean, you know so much, and this is so incredible, all the research you've done and how you're preserving your Bubbie's testimony. And yet you do kind of bring that into the book, that you are entering into this not knowing much about your family's story, etc. So I also appreciated that as well.
Yeah, I think it's really common for us not to know everything. I had a close relationship with my grandma, but a lot of people maybe didn't know their grandparents as well as they wanted, or didn't get to have these conversations. And I think it's part of the story. I think it's relevant that these things maybe didn't happen for a reason, that our elders were protecting us in a lot of ways. They were protecting themselves in a lot of ways. And it was really fascinating to me to like dig into that and start to understand some of the intention there.
Now, there's another question. You mentioned that your Bubbie was in Auschwitz. Somebody's asking if she had a tattoo from being in Auschwitz.
Yeah, this is a great question. She did not have a tattoo, and we don't know why. Why did some prisoners receive them and some did not? I often wondered if it was because she had kind of escaped within the system and they lost track of her. But she told me that her sister also didn't have a tattoo, and her sister was documented throughout her experience within the Nazi camp system. So I don't have an answer. They just didn't get tattoos. Perhaps it was late in the war. That's just not it's one of those details that I just like can't fully explain.
Now, I'm not a Holocaust expert. My grandmother also, my grandparents from Romania as well. It seems like since they did come at the end of the war, that they were trying to bring people in faster. So maybe they didn't get the numbers tattooed, even though they still had numbers. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure for everyone, but that does make sense. Um, and it's Madeline is asking, in your writing this as a memoir, how did you differentiate between your story and your Bubbie's? And did the two intertwine? It's a great question.
Yes. They definitely intertwine. I knew coming into this that I wouldn't be able to not give my perspective, that I would naturally have my own voice on the page and that would come through. And so in the book, I have chapters that are simply transcriptions of my interviews with my grandma, and I barely get a word in those. So it's really her chapters. So there's a way to read the book in which you're really just hearing her voice. And then there are all these other chapters in which I'm kind of adding color to what she's saying or explaining things that she's like leaving out or telling memories from my time with her. And so she's present in all of that as well. But I think it's a matter of voice, whether you're hearing primarily her voice or you're hearing primarily mine. And I just tried to blend them as much as possible, or not really blend, but weave them together so that you're getting a little bit of both of us.
And I notice in so many survivors' lives, food plays such an important role. And in your book, you have it prominently in some of your Bubbie's memories and even some of your own. And at the end of the book, you even include some of your Bubbie's recipes. So can you talk more about that?
Yeah, food was absolutely like a key part of her life. One, she endured a year of starvation within the war, and so she came out of that with a very distinct appreciation and kind of need for food, that wouldn't have been otherwise. To have that kind of deprivation, you develop a different sort of awareness of food and dependency on it, a realization that it's not guaranteed. So that was definitely something that shaped her. But then also the kitchen was this place where she really thrived. Like she could be creative there. She could be very skilled. She just mastered all of these recipes. She was in charge of feeding her family. She cooked all the time. She baked all the time. And so I also think she found kind of an outlet from cooking. She just didn't have that many possible outlets, and cooking was a place where she could really thrive. And she loved to feed people. Like that was her favorite thing. She always wanted to make something for someone and make sure they ate it. I think it was also just nourishing that she could do something that could give to others versus being the one who needs.
Quite beautiful. Um, so you mentioned, I think, or you list about 3 or 4 recipes in your book. Do you have a favorite of your Bubbie's food?
I mean, it does depend if I'm the one making it or if someone's making it for me. I've been making all of her recipes in the lead up to the publication of my book. And some of them I'm just like, God, she was so talented. This is so difficult. She made them all the time. And that was part of her secret, is that she just knew them at a level I just don't know them at nearly as much. But I think my favorite is probably her creamish. It's a Hungarian pastry, in which there's 2 layers of baked pastry dough, and then there's a custard cream filling. It just sounds simple, but every time I make it, I find it incredibly difficult. And so the recipe and kind of the story behind this dish is in the book. And I feel like going through the process of making it has really made me appreciate even more so her skill.
It's beautiful. And from reading your book, I found out that she wasn't necessarily an experienced cook to begin with, but she learned from others as she was growing up.
Yeah, I mean, it was a survival skill. She didn't have this, before the war. She was just a kid. And so after the war, after she got married, it became an expectation of her. So she started, spending time with her new sisters-in-law and learning from them and just developing her own kind of memorized bank of recipes that she could make.
Now, there's another great question, this one from Elizabeth, and it kind of goes into something that I was going to ask you. There's a difference between writing a book or writing a memoir and having it published. So Elizabeth asks, how were you able to get the book published?
Yes, this is its own distinct challenge. The canon of Holocaust literature is quite robust. And so it's definitely a lot of work to figure out, not just what's my story and how I'm going to tell it, but like, how does this fit into a marketplace of ideas? That was definitely its own challenge. I ended up publishing with an independent press based here in Chicago. And it's been an amazing experience, but there are a lot of different publishers, and I had to do a lot of research into the publishing industry to really figure out like where my book might fit and how to reach, a potential audience. Those are questions I think when you're a grandkid just thinking about your grandparent, you're not thinking at that level. And so certainly to get to the point of publishing, you do have to think more in terms of how the industry works, how books reach readers, and who's kind of making these books.
So your Bubbie always wanted you at that point to write the book. Was it always the intention to get it published?
I have no idea. This is the thing. My grandma didn't read books. Like, what was a book to her? Like, it's so fascinating to think about why a book. And I think about it, she didn't actually say the word book. She just said, I want you to write about me. And she did say, maybe you can sell it. So I suppose those two things was enough for me to say, like, this is a book. And maybe trying to write something shorter, I realized I couldn't. Like, this was a big story. It did need to be a full-length book. Um, but yeah, I don't know what her vision of it was. It might not have been exactly what I made, but I think it might be something close.
But for you, was the intention then to get it published? Was that important for you?
Yeah, I think at a certain point I was pouring enough into it that I did want it to reach others. And I felt like part of what my grandma was asking was to share her story. And so that became something I wanted, was to share her story and to reach other people. And there's something nice about kind of spreading the conversation and moving it forward.
I think that's so true. So Mark asks a great question. It was also a question that I had, so I love that it's two for one here. Is there a favorite passage that you have from your book that you would like your readers to pay close attention to?
Oh, wow, that is such a generous question. Thank you for that. Um, I don't have a favorite passage, but some of the ones that are maybe most significant to me are my experiences in Florida with my grandma during kind of the process of learning her story. So, for example, I go to a casino with her. That's probably not something people expect in a book about the Holocaust. But I tell her I'm going to pull the car around and pick her up at the front so she doesn't have to walk. And when I get to the front of the building, she's not there. I'm just like, how does someone lose their grandma? Like, how does this happen? I'm so confused. Where did she go? Little frustrating moments like that. Um, those are some of the things I still think about, and I know just ring so true to what it was like to be with her. And I really just wanted to like show her full humanity and our full relationship in the book, not just the hard parts or the beautiful parts, but like the full parts where things could be very tricky.
Yeah, it's funny as I as you brought that up, it reminds me as I was reading this, I'm like, this would make for a great movie. This love, this relationship between grandchild and grandmother, then also just going back into this life during the Holocaust. So that might not have been an intention of yours while you were writing it, but I can see it in the future. Um,
Yeah. One of the things that was an intention, though, after reading so many Holocaust books, is that there were so many books that were fully contained to the years of the war. And I did really want to talk about my grandma as I knew her and our relationship at the time, because I just saw it as so distinct from who she was during the war and what she experienced. And that was something I just couldn't find a lot of in survivor testimony, was what happened afterwards. And that was like a big question of like, how did we get from there to here? And that was something I put a lot of thought into, because it was like a question I had and I wanted to see more of.
And I'm so glad you did. As you said, a lot of, I think, even Holocaust survivors, they find that their quote unquote interesting part of their lives is talking about the Holocaust, but there's so much of their life happened after, and actually surviving and living after is so important. So I'm so happy you did that. We have more great questions in the chat, and it's wonderful because a lot of them, again, just mirror ones that I had. So one is saying that you have brought your Bubbie's story into schools, and they ask, how has it been received? And another thing that this person says, that they think you did such a great job with this project.
Thank you. So when I go to schools, I do only tell the Holocaust portion of her story. I'm not talking about who she was in my life or who I was in hers. I'm trying to present it, for an educational purpose. So I'm talking about what she saw, and what she experienced basically from 1944 to 1945. And I really focus it there. Students are always like gripped on the edge of their seat. I think they really don't get a lot of opportunities to hear these like personal and traumatic stories. Like if we think about how history is taught, it's rarely with this level of intensity. And so I think it often feels like a privilege to get to hear what someone experienced. That's been my experience. Every time I go to classrooms, I get completely different questions. And so I'm always kind of amazed by the kind of different types of curiosity that come out from hearing it. But it's always like a somewhat reverent experience, where they're really like listening and taking it in, because it's a story an adult is telling them that they have never heard before.
Julia asks, do you have a top 1 to 3 Holocaust books you would recommend to readers besides yours?
There are so many. This is a really hard question. Um, there's so many books that explore the Holocaust from different perspectives. So, for example, my book would fall into the category of a 3G memoir, a grandchild perspective, and there are other 3G memoirs as well. So if you're kind of interested in it from that angle, I really like Plunder by Menachem Kaiser. I like We Share the Same Sky by Rachel Sorati. I think those are both great. But there are also amazing works by survivors, by their children. Like I feel like there's kind of, it depends what type of book that you're looking for. Because there are some that go into a single experience. There are some that share multiple experiences. The Light of Our Days comes to mind if you're looking for a book that speaks to resistance. So I have too many is kind of my answer. There are a lot of good ones. And if you told me more about what you're interested in or looking for, I could narrow it down even more. There's just so many.
I appreciate you sharing some really great titles. Um, so you had this whole idea in your book. You talk about learning how to listen, right, to your grandma. So I'm just wondering, from what is the resounding lesson you learned from working with your Bubbie, and what is the lesson you take from her life and testimony?
Felt like every time I started to figure something out about my grandma, she showed me that the opposite is also true. So, for example, I just always saw her as a very outgoing social person. And then when we were in Florida, she saw a friend and like quickly moved on. And I was like, why didn't we hang out with her more or talk to her more? And she was like, she talks too much. I was like, okay, maybe she's not as outgoing and social as I always viewed. Maybe she's that, and sometimes she likes quiet or she likes to be alone. And there was just constantly like moment after moment of finding these contradictions in who I thought she was, and the fact that like I was right and I was wrong constantly. When I was trying to like understand what she could and couldn't handle, I was at times right and I was at times wrong. And so like slowly trying to embrace these contradictions, and rather than like, get to the bottom and find out really which way it goes, but to realize that two things can be true and that people are complex. I think that's something that she was constantly showing me, and I was constantly forced to learn.
And do you have any advice for those of us who are looking to explore their family's history, do ancestry research, or even to write or to interview family or to write a book about their family, whether for publication or not?
Yeah, I mean, so many different points to that. I think for the interview piece, there's this really great book, speaking of Holocaust books, called Survivor by Rebecca Clifford. And she talks about how oral history is an act of listening, and that rather than trying to shape the story or give the story a story arc by asking certain questions, the best thing you can do is just let the person talk and let them guide conversation. So you might get it started, you might ask questions, but just to also be open to what they're saying and to build on it or to listen, to take it in, to give them space to finish their thoughts rather than jumping in right away. Those are all really important kind of ways of learning someone's story. And so I would definitely recommend like giving yourself time and trying to be as quiet as possible and to listen as much as possible. And then for the research piece, I think talking openly about what you're doing and seeking out a lot of different sources is really helpful, because you never know where you're going to find a lead, or where a lead might take you. And so really like searching widely, I think, is an important part of the process.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, there was definitely a lot there. um, in your book, you bring up a very important point that the Holocaust did not start with gas chambers in Auschwitz. It began with words. I feel very much living in a world of words, sometimes dangerous words, like a prelude to something potentially worse than what we have right now. So what are your thoughts as a 3G of what's going on today, and how it may relate to that time when your Bubbie was growing up?
Yeah, there's this great kind of way of thinking, the 10 stages of genocide. And I did a lot of thinking about the end of that, which is denial. And that's a lot of what like the storytelling that we do, what it combats is not an erasure of this history, but a reclamation of it. But at the very beginning of that spectrum of how genocide begins, it does start with language. And it starts with kind of classifying people, thinking about them differently, perhaps labeling them as in some way subhuman or non-human. And so I think sometimes we can look past language, uh, but I think it's really important to be attentive to the words we use, how we describe people. And so I definitely I'm kind of in like an observer mode in taking in what I'm seeing, and just trying to kind of think about it through everything I've learned, and kind of where our risks are, where the dangers are, for us in a lot of different ways.
Well, thank you, Brooke. I just want to thank you so much for sharing with us tonight. Again, Mazel Tov on the publication of this incredible book. I always love to hold a book up and show it. You have one,
I
beautiful.
have
I
it.
have the digital copy, so I'm so happy to see it. It's beautiful, and I can't wait to buy it. The actual physical copy. We're grateful to have you involved with 3GNY and for all the support all you're doing to support Holocaust memory and education. And I want to thank everyone again for being here and joining us this evening. We're glad you took the time to hear Brooks share a story that must not be forgotten. You can learn more about Brooke, including how to purchase a copy of her book. It would make a great Hanukkah gift at brookerandel.com. That's BROOKE RANDEL.com. So, Brooke, I just want to say thank you again. And for those who are interested in learning more about 3GNY, you can go to 3GNY.org. And if you felt very moved by this program, you can support us with a gift, especially during this holiday time, that will support our educational programs. And we hope you'll consider doing that. And you can refer to the chat for ways to donate. I want to thank you all again for being here, supporting this program. And we would also love your feedback about tonight's event. So after, you can check an email for a quick survey to help us learn from tonight's program to better serve the 3GNY community. So again, thank you all for being here. Brooke, thank you so much for everything. Take care and have a great night.
Thank you.